Hey guys, tonight we're lighting up something that's been burning through history for thousands of years. Cannabis. From sacred temple smoke to a plant so illegal you could get life in prison for it, to a multi-billion-dollar industry with its own influencer culture. It's been outlawed, glamorized, criminalized and legalized, sometimes all in the same decade. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a real thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. Your suggestions genuinely shape where this channel goes, and I appreciate you taking the time to write in. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Also, quick mention, the channel is now live on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off with just the audio, there's a link in the description. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Have you ever wondered how a plant that grows practically like a weed became public enemy number one? Did you know cannabis used to be sold over the counter in pharmacies right next to cough drops? Did you know a cartoon-style propaganda film once tried to convince an entire generation that one joint led straight to a rooftop murder? Would you have survived a 1930s jazz club raid, or would you have been the first one arrested still holding the evidence? And could you have predicted that the same plant that got people thrown in prison for decades would one day have its own gift shop? Congratulations. You've just woken up in a world where cannabis has been a medicine, a menace, a mugshot, and a marketing opportunity, sometimes within the same 50 years. Let's find out how we got here. Long before anyone thought to criminalize it, cannabis was already doing the rounds of the ancient world, showing up in Chinese pharmacopoeias, Scythian burial mounds, and Indian religious texts, as though it had been personally invited to every early civilization's opening party. You find it first in ancient China, where physicians around 2,700 years before the Common Era were grinding cannabis seeds into remedies for pain, inflammation, and the kind of stomach troubles that come from eating something you probably shouldn't have. The plant wasn't hidden or whispered about. It sat right there in the medical texts, next to ginger and licorice root, treated with the same clinical seriousness as anything else in the imperial pharmacy. Emperor Shen Nung, credited with compiling some of the earliest known pharmacological writings, listed cannabis among the fundamental herbs of Chinese medicine, which is a bit like discovering that one of your ancestors kept meticulous notes on something your government would later spend billions of dollars trying to eradicate. Meanwhile, over in Central Asia, archaeologists digging through Kurgan burial mounds have uncovered charred cannabis seeds in small braziers, evidence that funeral rites sometimes involved a bit of ceremonial smoke to send the departed off properly. It is the ancient equivalent of lighting incense at a memorial service, except the incense also happened to be extremely effective at altering your mood, which either made the funeral more bearable or considerably more confusing depending on how much was used. In India, cannabis worked its way into religious and medical texts by around 1,000 years before the Common Era, referenced in the Atharva Veda as one of 5 sacred plants, tucked in alongside barley and other staples of daily life. It was not treated as an indulgence, it was treated as a gift, something bridging the human and the divine, which is a considerably more generous interpretation than the one it would receive a few thousand years later from men in suits holding gavels. Herodotus, the Greek historian who never met a strange custom he didn't want to write down, described the Scythians throwing cannabis seeds onto heated stones inside small tents and inhaling the resulting vapour with what he described as great enjoyment, howling with pleasure in a way that suggests the world's first recorded hotbox session was also its most historically documented. Even the ancient Assyrians got in on it, referencing a substance believed to be cannabis in cuneiform tablets used for religious fumigation, which tells you that as far back as written language itself, Someone was already burning this plant and figuring out what happened next. What's remarkable is not that ancient civilizations used cannabis. Plenty of plants got used for plenty of things back then. What's remarkable is how unremarkable it was. There was no moral panic, no congressional hearing, no black and white film warning parents that little Timothy might turn into a homicidal maniac after one puff. It was medicine, it was ritual, it was agriculture, and it moved through daily life with about as much controversy as chewing on a stalk of wheat. Thousands of years and thousands of miles apart, separate civilizations that never spoke to each other kept arriving at the same conclusion. This plant is useful. This plant has value. Let's write that down. It would take a few more millennia, several continents, and one extremely motivated American bureaucrat to convince everyone otherwise. While the pharaohs were busy building monuments that would outlast empires, cannabis was quietly working its way into Egyptian medical papyri, tucked between remedies for eye inflammation and instructions for the afterlife. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical document dating back to around 1500 years before the Common Era, references a plant many scholars believe was cannabis, recommended for conditions ranging from inflammation to what appears to be an early treatment for glaucoma symptoms, ground up and applied directly to sore eyes in a manner that modern ophthalmologists would probably not endorse, but ancient Egyptians seemed perfectly satisfied with. Traces of cannabis pollen have even turned up in the tomb of Rameses II, which raises the delightful possibility that one of history's most powerful pharaohs was buried with a little something extra for the journey into the underworld, presumably to take the edge off eternity. It wasn't just medicine either. Egyptian textiles and ropes sometimes incorporated hemp fibre, proving that even in a civilization obsessed with gold, linen and elaborate burial customs, someone still found time to appreciate a plant that could double as both a painkiller and a shopping bag. Cross the Mediterranean and the story continues. Ancient Greek physicians, including the widely respected Dioscorides, documented cannabis in their medical writings, describing its uses for pain relief and even noting its effects on fertility, which suggests the Greeks were doing careful clinical observation, while much of the rest of the ancient world was simply enjoying the vibes. The Greeks approached it with the same rigorous curiosity they applied to everything else, cataloguing its properties the way you might expect from a civilization that also invented democracy and the concept of arguing about literally anything in a public square. The Romans, never a culture to pass up something useful, incorporated hemp into rope making for their famously enormous naval fleets, meaning the very ships that helped build and defend an empire were quite literally held together by the same plants that would later be treated as contraband. Roman physician Pliny the Elder wrote about cannabis root being used to treat joint pain and cramping, describing it with the clinical detachment of someone writing about willow bark or chamomile, because to him, it simply was in that category. There was no whispered shame attached to any of this. No one in ancient Alexandria was hiding a stash under a false floorboard, glancing nervously at the door in case a Roman magistrate burst in. Cannabis moved through Mediterranean society as an accepted, practical, occasionally sacred substance, valued for exactly what it did rather than feared for what it might symbolize. It took root in medicine, in industry, in trade routes stretching from the Nile to the Aegean, all without a single propaganda film or congressional subcommittee getting involved. It is almost quaint to imagine a world where a plant could simply be useful without someone deciding it needed to be a moral crusade, and yet for thousands of years across an entire region, that is precisely and unremarkably what it was. The Scythians, a fierce nomadic people who apparently never met a horse they didn't like, or a hotbox tent they didn't enjoy, left behind archaeological evidence of cannabis rituals so thorough that Herodotus felt compelled to write it all down. Picture a group of warriors who spent their lives on horseback, conquering vast stretches of the Eurasian steppe, feared by neighbouring civilizations for their skill with a bow and their general unwillingness to be conquered by anyone. Now picture those same warriors, after a long day of terrifying the ancient world, climbing into a small felt tent, tossing cannabis seeds onto red-hot stones, and inhaling the resulting smoke with what Herodotus described as genuine delight. It is the equivalent of finding out the most intimidating person you know unwinds after work by lighting candles and taking a long bath, except with slightly more howling involved. Archaeological excavations of Scythian burial mounds, known as kurgans, have physically confirmed what Herodotus wrote. Braziers containing charred cannabis seeds have been found buried alongside the dead, suggesting the ritual wasn't limited to the living. It travelled with them into the afterlife, which tells you something about how central it was to their culture. This wasn't a recreational afterthought squeezed in between battles. It was woven into funerary practice, into mourning, into whatever cosmology the Scythians held about what happened after death. Herodotus, ever the meticulous note-taker, described entire groups gathering around these tents, and the way he wrote about it suggests communal use, something shared rather than hidden. Contrast that with the furtive, backroom energy cannabis would eventually pick up centuries later, and the difference is almost jarring. There was no shame here, no secrecy, no glancing over one shoulder while stuffing something into a coat pocket. The vapour rose, the warriors inhaled, and Herodotus, a Greek historian visiting from a culture that found the Scythians endlessly fascinating and more than a little alarming, simply reported what he saw with the same tone he might use to describe their diet or their burial customs. What's especially striking is the practical context surrounding all of this. The Scythians were expert horse breeders, skilled metal workers, and dangerous adversaries on the battlefield, hardly a civilization anyone would describe as unfocused or unproductive. Cannabis use existed alongside all of that, not in opposition to it. It was simply part of how they lived, how they grieved, and apparently how they relaxed after a long stretch of being one of the most feared cavalry forces on the continent. There is something almost funny about imagining these fierce warriors sitting cross-legged in a tent, deeply and sincerely enjoying themselves, while the rest of the ancient world quietly hoped they wouldn't show up at their border again anytime soon. It turns out even history's most intimidating conquerors needed a way to unwind, and theirs just happened to leave behind enough physical evidence to convince modern archaeologists several thousand years later that the party was every bit as real as Herodotus claimed. As trade routes stretched from China to the Mediterranean, cannabis hitched a ride alongside silk, spices, and questionable medical advice, spreading its influence one caravan stop at a time. Imagine a merchant loading up a camel with bolts of silk, jars of spice, small clay vessels of medicine, and somewhere in among all of it, seeds or preparations of cannabis destined for a market thousands of miles from where they started. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route for luxury goods. It was an information highway, carrying ideas, remedies, and cultural practices across an enormous stretch of the ancient world, and cannabis moved along it with the same quiet persistence as everything else being hauled through the desert. Traders moving between China, Central Asia, Persia, and eventually the Mediterranean weren't just exchanging goods. They were exchanging knowledge, and cannabis cultivation techniques and medicinal applications travelled right alongside the physical plant itself. A merchant in one region might learn that cannabis eased joint pain from a Chinese trader, only to pass that knowledge along to a Persian healer a few stops later, who then adapted it to fit local medical traditions. It is essentially the ancient version of a product review spreading by word of mouth, except instead of a 5-star rating on a phone screen, it was a caravan driver mentioning it to a physician over a shared meal at a desert outpost. Persian medical texts eventually incorporated cannabis into their own pharmacological traditions, drawing partly from Indian and Chinese sources that had filtered westward over centuries of contact. The plant adapted to whatever culture it landed in, sometimes treated as medicine, sometimes woven into religious or spiritual practice, sometimes simply grown for its fiber, and the flexibility of its uses is a big part of why it managed to travel so far without losing relevance along the way. By the time cannabis knowledge reached the edges of the Mediterranean world, it had picked up centuries of accumulated wisdom from multiple civilizations, each one adding its own interpretation, its own preferred method of preparation, its own theories about what it was good for. It's the botanical equivalent of a folk song that gets passed from town to town, picking up new verses and slightly different melodies with each retelling, until the final version bears only a loose resemblance to where it started, but somehow still carries the same essential spirit. What's easy to overlook is just how unremarkable this diffusion was at the time. No one treated the spread of cannabis along these trade routes as scandalous or dangerous. It moved the same way turmeric or cinnamon moved, valued for what it offered and traded accordingly. The panic, the criminalization, the entire moral apparatus that would eventually surround this plant simply didn't exist yet. It was cargo, it was medicine, it was occasionally ritual, and it crossed deserts and mountain passes for centuries, connecting civilizations that otherwise had little direct contact, all while nobody involved had the faintest idea that a few thousand years later, an entirely different country on an entirely different continent would spend enormous amounts of money trying to make the whole thing disappear. Long before anyone worried about getting arrested for it, American colonists were required by law to grow hemp, which makes the plant's later criminal record feel a little like being fired from a job you were once legally obligated to show up for. In the early 1600s, the Virginia colony passed legislation mandating that farmers grow hemp, and similar laws followed in Massachusetts and Connecticut, because hemp fiber was essential for producing rope, sailcloth, and textiles at a time when a colony's survival depended heavily on ships staying afloat and clothing staying intact. This wasn't a suggestion tucked into some agricultural pamphlet. It was law, enforced with fines for farmers who failed to comply, which means there were almost certainly colonial farmers grumbling about mandatory hemp quotas the way a modern worker might grumble about a mandatory training seminar. Hemp became so foundational to colonial economies that it was accepted as legal tender in some regions, meaning you could pay your taxes with it in places like Virginia and Pennsylvania. Picture walking up to a colonial tax collector with a wagon full of hemp instead of coins, and the tax collector nodding approvingly because that was, in fact, an acceptable form of payment. It is difficult to imagine a modern equivalent, though showing up to the Internal Revenue Service with a truckload of plant fibre and expecting a receipt would certainly generate some interesting paperwork today. Founding figures including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson grew hemp on their own estates, treating it as a legitimate and valuable cash crop alongside tobacco and other staples. Washington's diaries reference hemp cultivation at Mount Vernon, discussing planting schedules and harvest yields with the same practical tone he might use for wheat or corn, because to him, and to virtually everyone else in colonial America, it simply was an agricultural commodity. There was no distinction drawn at the time between hemp grown for fibre and cannabis grown for its psychoactive properties, largely because the strains cultivated for industrial use contained minimal amounts of the compound that would later become the centre of so much controversy. Colonial hemp was for rope, sails, and cloth, full stop, and the idea that this crop would one day become synonymous with criminal contraband would have struck any colonial farmer as somewhere between confusing and absurd. Shipbuilders relied on hemp rope because of its durability in salt water, and an entire supply chain grew up around its cultivation, processing, and distribution, feeding directly into the naval and commercial infrastructure that allowed the colonies to trade, explore, and eventually fight a revolution. It is worth sitting with the irony here. A plant once required by law, grown by the very men who would go on to found a nation, woven into the literal fabric and rigging of that nation's earlier ships, would spend the majority of the following 2 centuries transforming into one of the most aggressively criminalized substances in American history. Somewhere between mandatory colonial farming quotas and modern mandatory minimum sentencing laws, the story of this plant took a turn nobody standing in a 17th century Virginia field could have possibly predicted, holding a fistful of hemp seeds and wondering only whether the harvest would be good enough to pay this year's taxes. By the 1800s, cannabis tinctures sat on pharmacy shelves next to cough syrups and headache powders, marketed with the same understated confidence as a product that definitely wouldn't get you thrown in a jail cell a century later. Walk into an American or British pharmacy during the Victorian era, and you might find bottles labelled extract of cannabis indica, sold openly, no prescription required, no furtive glances exchanged between customer and pharmacist. It sat there next to laudanum, next to various tinctures containing what we would now consider alarming quantities of controlled substances, all marketed toward the same basic goal of making Victorian ailments a little more bearable. Irish physician William O'Shaughnessy is largely credited with introducing cannabis to Western medicine in a serious clinical way, having studied its use in India during the 1830s and returning with detailed observations on its effectiveness for treating convulsions, muscle spasms and pain. His research made its way into British and American medical journals, and from there cannabis extract began appearing in mainstream pharmaceutical catalogues, recommended by physicians for everything from migraines to menstrual cramps to the kind of general nervous exhaustion that Victorian society seemed perpetually diagnosed with. Queen Victoria herself reportedly used cannabis tinctures for menstrual pain, prescribed by her physician, which means the same substance that would eventually be treated as a dangerous narcotic was, for a period, considered perfectly appropriate for the reigning monarch of the British Empire. It is difficult to imagine a modern government official recommending a Schedule 1 narcotic to a head of state, and yet here we have a documented case of exactly that kind of casual medical endorsement occurring at the highest levels of society. American pharmaceutical companies including Eli Lilly and Park Davis manufactured and sold cannabis extracts throughout the latter half of the 19th century, packaged in neatly labelled bottles alongside their other products, marketed with the straightforward, matter-of-fact tone typical of the era's medical advertising. There was no stigma baked into the marketing, no warning labels, no ominous fine print, just a product claiming to relieve pain and discomfort, sitting on a shelf between products making similarly bold and occasionally dubious claims. Physicians of the time genuinely believed in its therapeutic value, and to be fair, modern research has actually validated some of those Victorian-era observations regarding its usefulness for muscle spasms and certain types of chronic pain, which means the doctors prescribing it were not entirely off base, even if their understanding of dosing and standardization left something to be desired. What makes this chapter so striking in retrospect is the sheer normalcy of it all. There were no undercover investigations, no dramatic newspaper headlines linking cannabis extract to violent crime, no political careers built on eradicating it from society. It was simply medicine, imperfect and occasionally overprescribed the way most Victorian medicine was, but medicine nonetheless, trusted by doctors and used by everyone from working-class patients to the Queen herself. The transformation from pharmacy shelf staple to criminalised substance did not happen because the plant changed. It happened because the century did, and the story of exactly how that happened involves considerably more politics, prejudice, and bureaucratic ambition than it ever did pharmacology. As refugees fled the chaos of the Mexican Revolution into the American Southwest, they brought cannabis with them, along with a word, marijuana, that would soon become a linguistic weapon in a campaign built more on prejudice than pharmacology. Beginning around 1910, waves of Mexican immigrants crossed into states like Texas and New Mexico, escaping violence and instability at home, carrying with them cultural practices that included recreational cannabis use, something already established in parts of Mexico for decades. The plant itself wasn't new to America. It had been sitting on pharmacy shelves for generations already, known clinically as cannabis. But the word marijuana, tied specifically to these new immigrant communities, gave American officials and newspapers a convenient linguistic tool to make an old plant sound like a brand new threat. This is one of the more uncomfortable truths buried in cannabis history. The shift from cannabis to marijuana in public discourse wasn't a scientific reclassification. It was a rebranding exercise soaked in xenophobia, allowing officials to associate the substance with a specific, marginalized ethnic group rather than with the broader population that had been casually using cannabis tinctures for headaches just a few decades earlier. Local newspapers in border states began running stories linking marijuana use among Mexican immigrant communities to crime and violence, often with little to no evidence beyond generalized suspicion and outright racial anxiety. It didn't take long for these sentiments to translate into legislation. Between 1915 and 1931, 29 states passed laws criminalizing cannabis, and while the official justifications varied from state to state, the underlying anxiety driving much of this legislation was unmistakably tied to fears about Mexican immigration and, in some regions, to anxieties about black communities in jazz clubs, another connection that would only intensify in the following decade. Police departments in border towns used marijuana laws as a convenient tool for targeting Mexican immigrant communities specifically, providing law enforcement with legal justification for surveillance and arrest that had less to do with genuine concern over the plant's effects and considerably more to do with controlling and monitoring a population many white Americans viewed with suspicion during a period of economic uncertainty and rapid demographic change. It is worth sitting with the strange linguistic sleight of hand at play here. The same plant, extracted into tinctures and sold by respected pharmaceutical companies just decades earlier, suddenly became something sinister and foreign the moment it got attached to a Spanish word and a marginalized immigrant population. Nothing about the chemistry changed. What changed was who was using it, and more importantly, how officials and newspapers chose to describe who was using it. This period effectively laid the linguistic and cultural groundwork for everything that followed. The word marijuana carried with it an entire cargo of racial anxiety and moral panic that the word cannabis simply never had, and government officials in the coming decades would prove remarkably skilled at exploiting exactly that distinction, using it to build one of the most aggressive and enduring prohibition campaigns in American history. Enter Harry Anslinger, a bureaucrat with a badge, a grudge, and an almost supernatural talent for turning a plant into a national boogeyman through sheer force of alarmist testimony. Appointed as the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, Anslinger inherited an agency with an obvious problem. Alcohol prohibition had just ended, leaving an entire enforcement apparatus suddenly short on things to enforce. Anslinger needed a new enemy to justify his agency's budget and his own relevance, and cannabis, freshly associated in the public mind with Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians thanks to the shifting linguistics of the previous decade, presented itself as a remarkably convenient target. What followed was less a public health campaign and more a masterclass in strategic fear-mongering. Anslinger began feeding sensationalized, frequently fabricated stories to newspapers, describing marijuana as a substance capable of turning otherwise ordinary people into violent maniacs. He testified before Congress with claims that would embarrass any serious pharmacologist. Describing cases of murder and mayhem he attributed directly to cannabis use, most of which were either wildly exaggerated or entirely unsupported by evidence. One frequently repeated claim involved a young man supposedly committing an axe murder on his family after smoking marijuana, a story Anslinger circulated widely despite its shaky factual foundation, because a horrifying anecdote proved considerably more persuasive to lawmakers and the public than any actual scientific data available at the time. Anslinger's rhetoric leaned heavily and unapologetically into racial framing. He is documented as having made statements linking marijuana use specifically to Black and Mexican communities, framing the substance as a threat to white American society in language that reads, even by the standards of the era, as strikingly explicit in its prejudice. He reportedly claimed that marijuana caused white women to seek relationships with black men, a statement so nakedly rooted in racial anxiety that it tells you almost everything you need to know about what was actually driving this campaign, and it certainly wasn't concern about public health outcomes. Anslinger also cultivated relationships with journalists and studio executives, most notably encouraging the production of sensationalized anti-marijuana content that would soon reach movie theaters across the country. He understood, with an almost cynical clarity, that public opinion could be shaped far more effectively through fear and spectacle than through careful scientific argument, and he built an entire career on that understanding. Under his leadership, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics became the primary engine driving marijuana prohibition at the federal level, and Anslinger himself remained in his position for over 3 decades, shaping American drug policy longer than almost any other single bureaucrat in the nation's history. What makes his story so remarkable and so unsettling is how thoroughly one man's personal ambition and prejudice managed to reshape national policy on a substance that had, just years earlier, been sitting quietly and respectably on pharmacy shelves. Anslinger didn't discover a genuine public health crisis. He manufactured one, brick by fabricated brick, and the country, primed by decades of racial anxiety and freshly unemployed prohibition agents looking for a new mission, was more than willing to believe him. In 1936, a film emerged that took cannabis use and escalated it to hit-and-run manslaughter and spontaneous piano-based hallucinations, all within about 68 melodramatic minutes. Originally titled Tell Your Children, the film that would eventually become known as Reefer Madness was produced as a cautionary tale intended to warn parents about the supposed dangers of marijuana use among teenagers, and it accomplishes this goal with a level of dramatic overreach that borders on unintentional comedy even by the standards of 1930s melodrama. The plot follows a group of high school students who are lured into smoking marijuana at parties, after which their lives rapidly spiral into a nightmarish sequence of manic laughter, sexual impropriety, a hit-and-run car accident, a suicide, and an eventual descent into madness, all supposedly triggered by a substance the film treats as somewhere between a narcotic and a demonic possession. One character experiences a psychotic breakdown after a single use. Another commits manslaughter behind the wheel. It is less a public health film and more a fever dream constructed by someone who had heard about marijuana second-hand from an extremely unreliable source and decided to build an entire screenplay around the worst possible interpretation of every rumour. The film was originally funded by a church group intending to use it as a moralistic warning shown to parents, but it was quickly purchased and re-edited by an exploitation film producer named Dwayne Esper, who recognised its potential as sensationalist entertainment rather than earnest public health messaging. Esper toured the film through the exploitation film circuit for years, marketing it under lurid taglines that promised shocking depictions of drug-fueled depravity, essentially transforming what began as an earnest, if wildly inaccurate cautionary tale into a piece of gleeful shock cinema screened at seedy theatres well outside the mainstream circuit. The irony here is almost too perfect. A film designed to terrify audiences about the corrupting influence of marijuana ended up being distributed by a man whose entire business model revolved around exploiting exactly the kind of moral panic the film itself was trying to generate. For decades, reefer madness sat largely forgotten, an artifact of a bygone era's dramatic overreach, until it experienced an unexpected second life in the 1970s. College students and countercultural audiences rediscovered the film, screening it not as a serious warning but as pure comedic entertainment, laughing uproariously at its wild exaggerations and melodramatic performances. It became something of a cult classic on the midnight movie circuit, watched ironically by exactly the demographic it had originally been designed to frighten. There is a particular kind of historical justice in that transformation, a piece of propaganda specifically engineered to terrify young people about cannabis, instead became a beloved punchline among young people who used cannabis, howling with laughter at its absurdity rather than trembling in fear of its warnings. Reefer madness endures today not as an effective piece of persuasion, but as a monument to just how far institutional fear-mongering was willing to go. Packaged in black and white film stock and dramatic piano stings, in service of a moral panic built on almost nothing but imagination and prejudice. With one stroke of bureaucratic paperwork, the federal government effectively made cannabis illegal nationwide, proving that sometimes the most dramatic historical turning points look suspiciously like tax forms. The Marijuana Tax Act, passed in 1937, didn't technically criminalize cannabis outright. Instead, it required anyone involved in the sale or distribution of cannabis to register and pay a tax, a seemingly bureaucratic requirement that concealed a far more calculated purpose. The tax stamps required for legal cannabis transactions were almost never issued, meaning that anyone attempting to comply with the law by seeking the proper documentation would typically be denied, then arrested for possessing cannabis without the tax stamp they'd just been refused. It was a legal trap disguised as tax policy, and it worked exactly as Harry Anslinger and his allies in Congress intended. The hearings preceding the Act's passage were themselves a study in how thin the actual evidence was. The American Medical Association's own representative, Dr. William Woodward, testified against the bill, pointing out that there was no legitimate scientific basis for the sweeping claims being made about cannabis, and criticizing the rushed, evidence-light nature of the legislative process. His testimony was largely dismissed, and in some accounts actively misrepresented by committee members eager to move the bill forward, regardless of expert objection. Congress spent remarkably little time actually debating the substance itself, and one particularly telling detail from the legislative record involves a congressman asking what marijuana even was, receiving a vague answer, and the bill proceeding to a vote anyway. This wasn't careful, deliberative policy-making. It was a rushed, largely predetermined outcome dressed up in the language of tax regulation, specifically because framing it as a tax measure allowed the federal government to sidestep certain constitutional questions about federal authority over what had previously been treated as a matter for individual states to regulate. Once passed, the Marijuana Tax Act effectively ended the era of cannabis as illegal, over-the-counter pharmaceutical product. Physicians who had been prescribing cannabis tinctures for decades now found themselves facing new bureaucratic hurdles and social stigma for continuing to do so. And pharmaceutical companies that had once manufactured and sold cannabis extracts openly began quietly discontinuing their product lines rather than deal with the tax structure and its accompanying legal risk. The chilling effect rippled outward from there. Cannabis research, which had been slowly accumulating in medical journals for decades, largely ground to a halt as researchers found it increasingly difficult and legally risky to study a substance now treated with such active suspicion by federal authorities. What began as a plant sitting comfortably on pharmacy shelves just a generation earlier had, through a combination of manufactured moral panic, racially charged rhetoric, and a piece of legislation cleverly disguised as tax policy, transformed into a substance surrounded by criminal liability. The Marijuana Tax Act didn't need to say the word illegal to accomplish exactly that outcome, and in some ways, that quiet, bureaucratic sleight of hand made it all the more effective, slipping prohibition into the law books dressed in the unassuming, forgettable language of tax code, rather than the dramatic language of outright criminalization. In the smoky clubs of Harlem, cannabis became intertwined with jazz culture, which meant the crackdown on the plant was never really just about the plant. Walk into a Harlem jazz club during the 1920s and 30s, and you would find cannabis woven casually into the social fabric of the scene, referenced openly in song lyrics, discussed in interviews, and used by some of the era's most celebrated musicians as part of their creative and social lives. Louis Armstrong, one of the most influential musicians in American history, was open about his own use, once describing it in later interviews as a friendly, harmless substance far preferable to alcohol, a sentiment he apparently held for decades despite an arrest in 1930 for cannabis possession that resulted in a brief jail stint. Songs of the era referenced the substance under an array of coded slang terms, weaving it into the language of the music itself so thoroughly that the culture and the substance became almost inseparable in the public imagination, for better and for worse. This connection between cannabis and jazz culture did not go unnoticed by Harry Anslinger and his allies, who saw in it a convenient and politically useful narrative. Anslinger explicitly targeted jazz musicians in his rhetoric, framing their creativity and their culture as evidence of moral and social decay rather than artistic innovation, and his agency reportedly kept files specifically tracking prominent musicians, treating their cannabis use as a law enforcement priority in a way that reads today less like public health policy and considerably more like targeted cultural surveillance. The racial dimension here is impossible to separate from the story. Harlem's jazz scene was overwhelmingly associated with black musicians and black cultural life, and the moral panic surrounding cannabis use in these clubs cannot be understood apart from the broader anxieties white American society held about black cultural influence during this period. Jazz itself was frequently described in mainstream press coverage using language soaked in racial anxiety, framed as dangerous, hypnotic, and corrupting to impressionable young white listeners, and cannabis became one more thread in that same tapestry of fear, offering law enforcement a legal pretext for surveilling and criminalizing spaces that were, more than anything else, simply vibrant centers of black artistic life. What's striking in retrospect is how much creative output emerged from exactly the culture officials were trying to suppress. Some of the most enduring and influential American music of the 20th century came directly out of these smoky, informally regulated Harlem venues, produced by artists who were simultaneously creating a defining cultural movement and being treated by federal authorities as a public menace worth actively monitoring. The crackdown on cannabis in these communities functioned as a kind of proxy war, allowing officials to police black cultural spaces under the more palatable, seemingly neutral banner of drug enforcement rather than admitting outright that the real target was the culture itself. It is a pattern that would repeat itself in various forms throughout the coming decades of American drug policy. Cannabis enforcement consistently falling hardest on communities that white authorities found culturally threatening, for reasons that had considerably less to do with pharmacology and considerably more to do with who exactly was doing the smoking. By the 1950s, cannabis had found new champions in a group of restless writers who smoked, scribbled, and philosophized their way into cultural infamy. Figures like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg treated cannabis as part of a broader rejection of 1950s conformity, weaving references to it directly into their published work at a time when doing so carried genuine legal and social risk. Ginsberg's poem Howl, published in 1956, references drug use openly and became the subject of an obscenity trial, drawing considerable public attention not just to the poem's sexual content but to its unapologetic depiction of a countercultural lifestyle that included casual cannabis use as simply one part of a broader rebellion against mainstream American values. Kerouac's writing, most famously On the Road, published in 1957, captured a restless wandering lifestyle in which drug use, cannabis included, appeared as one thread among many in a tapestry of jazz clubs, cross-country travel, and philosophical searching, presented without the moralizing judgment that mainstream media coverage of drug use typically carried during this period. The Beats weren't hiding their habits behind euphemism or plausible deniability the way earlier generations sometimes had. They wrote about it directly, treating cannabis use as simply one facet of a broader lifestyle built around rejecting the buttoned-up conformity of post-war American culture. And in doing so, they inadvertently created some of the first widely read and culturally significant literary depictions of cannabis use as something other than a moral catastrophe. This did not go over well with cultural gatekeepers of the era. Beat writers were frequently characterized in mainstream press coverage as degenerate, dangerous influences on impressionable youth, their work dismissed by many critics as self-indulgent nonsense, dressed up in literary pretension, and their association with drug use only reinforced existing anxieties about where American youth culture seemed to be heading. Yet the Beat movement's influence proved remarkably durable, seeping into the broader cultural consciousness in ways that outlasted the initial critical dismissal. Their casual, unashamed literary treatment of cannabis represented an early crack in the wall of unified moral panic that had surrounded the substance since the 1930s, offering an alternative narrative, however marginal at the time, in which cannabis use appeared not as a gateway to axe murders and manic piano playing, but simply as one part of an artistic, intellectually curious lifestyle. College campuses in particular began absorbing Beat literature, and its associated cultural attitudes throughout the late 1950s and into the following decade, planting seeds that would bloom considerably more visibly once the counterculture movement of the 1960s arrived in full force. It is worth appreciating just how quietly radical this literary moment actually was. A generation of writers, operating well outside the mainstream and facing genuine legal risk for their work, simply refused to treat cannabis use as something requiring shame or apology, describing it instead with the same matter-of-fact tone they applied to jazz clubs, cross-country road trips, and late-night philosophical conversations. It wasn't a political statement in the way the following decade's activism would be. It was simply honest reporting on a lifestyle, and that honesty, unglamorous and unapologetic in equal measure, helped lay the groundwork for the far louder cultural shift that was about to arrive. As the 60s rolled in with tie-dye and rebellion, cannabis went from a subculture secret to a full-blown generational symbol, practically overnight. What had existed as a relatively contained cultural undercurrent among jazz musicians and beat writers exploded outward in the 1960s into something far larger and considerably more visible, adopted by college students, anti-war protesters, and an entire generation increasingly skeptical of the institutions their parents had trusted without question. Cannabis use became closely associated with the broader countercultural movement, appearing at protests, at music festivals, and on college campuses across the country, transforming from a relatively marginal practice into something approaching a generational identifier. The 1967 Summer of Love in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood became a kind of cultural epicenter for this shift, with cannabis use woven casually into a broader lifestyle that included psychedelic music, communal living experiments, and open rejection of mainstream American values around work, sexuality, and authority. Newspapers and television reports of the era frequently focused on the visible cannabis use at these gatherings, often with a tone somewhere between fascination and alarm, presenting young people gathered in parks and on college lawns as evidence of a generation coming dangerously unmoored from traditional values. Woodstock in 1969 further cemented this cultural association, with cannabis smoke drifting visibly over crowds captured in photographs and documentary footage that would go on to define the visual language of an entire era. For many young Americans, using cannabis became an act loaded with meaning well beyond the substance itself. It represented a rejection of parental authority, a statement of solidarity with anti-war and civil rights movements, and a marker of belonging to a generation that saw itself as fundamentally different from the one that had come before. This shift alarmed officials considerably more than the relatively contained jazz club and beat literature scenes of previous decades had, precisely because of its scale. This wasn't a subculture confined to specific clubs or literary circles anymore. It was spreading rapidly across college campuses and suburban neighborhoods alike, crossing class and geographic lines in a way that made it feel, to worried parents and anxious politicians, like a genuine threat to the social fabric rather than a contained curiosity. Cannabis arrests during this period increased substantially, and college campuses in particular became sites of frequent conflict between administration, police, and students over drug policy enforcement. The political dimension of cannabis use during this decade cannot be separated from the broader anti-war and civil rights movements happening simultaneously. Nixon administration officials and later Nixon himself would go on to explicitly connect drug policy to broader efforts at social control, a connection that later historical analysis and even some officials' own later statements would confirm was every bit as intentional as it appeared at the time. What began as a quiet cultural undercurrent flowing through Harlem jazz clubs and beat poetry readings had, within the span of just one turbulent decade, become one of the most visible and politically charged cultural battlegrounds in the entire country, setting the stage directly for the far more aggressive and consequential federal crackdown that was about to follow. In 1970, cannabis was officially classified as a Schedule I substance, lumped in with drugs considered to have no medical value whatsoever, a classification that would haunt research and policy for decades. The Controlled Substances Act, signed into law under President Richard Nixon, created a tiered system for classifying drugs based on their potential for abuse and their recognized medical value, and cannabis landed in the most restrictive category available, Schedule I, placed alongside heroin and LSD despite decades of prior medical use documented all the way back through Victorian-era pharmacy shelves. This classification wasn't the product of careful scientific deliberation. It was, by most historical accounts, a placeholder decision made under considerable political pressure, with the expectation that a commission would soon study the issue properly and potentially recommend reclassification based on actual evidence. That commission did meet, and its findings, as we'll get into shortly, were promptly ignored, but the Schedule 1 classification itself remained locked firmly in place regardless. The practical consequences of this decision rippled outward for decades. Schedule 1 status meant that cannabis was officially designated as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, a combination that made legitimate scientific research on the substance extraordinarily difficult to conduct. Researchers seeking to study cannabis needed to navigate a Byzantine federal approval process, and the primary legal source of research-grade cannabis in the United States became a single government-contracted farm at the University of Mississippi, a bottleneck that severely limited the scope and pace of scientific inquiry for generations of researchers who might otherwise have been studying its properties with the same rigour applied to other medications. Nixon's own public statements during this period reveal a political dimension that extended well beyond simple drug policy concerns. In private recordings and later corroborated by statements from his own aides, Nixon's war on drugs has been described by former domestic policy advisor John Ehrlichman in a frequently cited later interview as being motivated substantially by a desire to disrupt and criminalize anti-war activists and black communities, two groups Nixon's administration viewed as political threats but couldn't legally target directly. Whether or not every detail of that account is taken at face value, it aligns closely with the broader pattern visible throughout this entire era of cannabis policy, in which drug enforcement consistently seemed to track along lines of political and racial anxiety far more precisely than it tracked along lines of actual pharmacological risk. The Controlled Substances Act didn't invent cannabis prohibition. That groundwork had been laid decades earlier through the Marihuana Tax Act and subsequent state and federal legislation. But it did formalize and entrench that prohibition within a scientific-sounding classification system that lent the entire framework an appearance of medical legitimacy it had never actually earned. For the next several decades, that Schedule 1 classification would serve as the primary legal obstacle blocking research, blocking medical use, and blocking any serious legislative reconsideration of cannabis policy, all resting on a decision made in a hurry under considerable political pressure by an administration whose own internal motivations, according to its own officials, had considerably less to do with public health than with control. Nixon's own hand-picked commission concluded that cannabis prohibition was doing more harm than the drug itself, a finding the administration promptly filed under absolutely not. The National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, commonly known as the Schaefer Commission after its chairman, former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer, was established specifically to provide the scientific and social analysis that had been so conspicuously absent from the rushed 1970 scheduling decision. Nixon presumably expected the commission, staffed largely with figures he considered ideologically sympathetic, to return findings that would support and reinforce his administration's already aggressive stance on cannabis. What he got instead was an extensively researched report that arrived at almost the exact opposite conclusion. Released in 1972 under the title Marijuana, A Signal of Misunderstanding, the report concluded that cannabis use, particularly for personal consumption, did not warrant the severity of criminal penalties currently being applied, and it specifically recommended decriminalizing possession of small amounts for personal use. The Commission's research found that cannabis posed considerably less risk to public health and safety than the prevailing rhetoric of the era suggested, and it explicitly criticized the existing enforcement framework as disproportionate, costly, and largely ineffective at achieving its stated public health goals. This was not a fringe or radical document. It was produced by a commission Nixon himself had assembled, staffed with credentialed researchers, physicians, and public officials who had approached the question with considerably more rigor than Congress had managed during the rushed hearings, preceding the Marijuana Tax Act decades earlier. Nixon's response to this carefully researched, methodically documented report was to reject its central recommendations almost entirely and continue pursuing an aggressive prohibition and enforcement strategy regardless. In private recordings from this period, Nixon can be heard expressing frustration and disdain for the Commission's findings, dismissing conclusions that directly contradicted the political narrative his administration had already invested so heavily in publicly promoting. The report was effectively shelved, receiving nowhere near the political attention or media coverage that Anslinger's earlier alarmist claims had managed to generate decades before, despite representing a considerably more rigorous and evidence-based body of work. This moment represents one of the clearest and most well-documented examples in the entire history of American cannabis policy of scientific findings being deliberately overridden by political considerations. It wasn't a case of insufficient research or genuine scientific uncertainty. The research existed, it was thorough, it came from a commission the administration itself had created, and its conclusions were simply set aside because they conflicted with an already established political and enforcement agenda. The consequences of that decision rippled forward for decades. Enforcement continued to intensify throughout the following years rather than moderate. Incarceration rates for cannabis-related offences climbed steadily, and the scientific consensus reflected in the Schaefer Commission's findings would not meaningfully influence federal policy for several more decades, not until individual states began independently pursuing decriminalization and legalization efforts, starting in the 1990s, essentially picking up several decades late, precisely where Nixon's own commission had already concluded the conversation should have started. As the war on drugs escalated through the 70s and 80s, cannabis arrests became a leading contributor to a prison population that ballooned in ways still being unpacked today. Following Nixon's formal declaration of a war on drugs and the subsequent decades of policy built on that foundation, cannabis enforcement intensified considerably, driven by increasingly harsh mandatory minimum sentencing laws passed throughout the 1970s and 80s. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, passed during the Reagan administration, introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug offences that applied with remarkably little judicial discretion, meaning judges found themselves handing down lengthy prison sentences for cannabis-related offences regardless of the specific circumstances involved, simply because the quantity thresholds written into the legislation left them with essentially no other legal option. The scale of this shift, viewed across decades, is genuinely staggering. The American prison population grew from roughly 200,000 people in the early 1970s to well over 2 million by the early 2000s, a period frequently referred to by historians and criminal justice researchers as the era of mass incarceration and drug offences. Cannabis, prominently among them, represented a substantial and consistently growing share of that expansion. Federal Bureau of Investigation data from this period shows cannabis arrests consistently accounting for roughly half of all drug arrests nationwide throughout much of the 1990s and 2000s. The overwhelming majority of those arrests specifically for possession rather than for sale or distribution. This means the vast majority of people swept into this enforcement machinery weren't drug traffickers running elaborate criminal operations. They were individuals found with personal amounts of a substance that, within just a few decades, entire state governments would be legally selling through licensed retail storefronts. The financial cost of this enforcement apparatus reached into the tens of billions of dollars annually when accounting for policing, prosecution, and incarceration expenses, resources that critics increasingly argued could have been directed toward public health initiatives, education, or addiction treatment programs with considerably better documented outcomes. Beyond the financial toll, the human cost proved enormous and difficult to fully quantify. A cannabis conviction, even for simple possession, could permanently affect employment prospects, housing applications, eligibility for federal student aid, and voting rights depending on the state, creating cascading consequences that extended for years or decades beyond whatever sentence had originally been served. Families were separated, communities lost working-age adults to lengthy prison terms, and entire generations in some neighborhoods grew up with the criminal justice system functioning as an ever-present, deeply disruptive force in daily life. What makes this chapter of cannabis history particularly difficult to reconcile with the earlier chapters is the sheer scale of the gap between cause and consequence. A plant that had spent much of the 19th century sitting quietly on pharmacy shelves, treated with the same casual acceptance as cough syrup, had by the late 20th century become the basis for one of the largest sustained expansions of the American carceral state in the nation's history, its enforcement falling, as we'll examine next, with a weight and frequency that was anything but evenly distributed across American communities. Enforcement of cannabis laws fell disproportionately on Black and Latino communities, a pattern documented so thoroughly that it eventually became impossible for lawmakers to keep pretending otherwise, despite decades of federal survey data consistently showing that cannabis usage rates were roughly comparable across racial demographics in the United States. Arrest and incarceration data told an entirely different story. A widely cited American Civil Liberties Union report examining data through the early 2000s found that Black Americans were arrested for cannabis possession at rates nearly 4 times higher than white Americans nationally, despite using the substance at statistically similar rates, and in some individual counties and cities, that disparity climbed considerably higher still, reaching 8 or even 10 times higher in certain jurisdictions. This wasn't a subtle statistical quirk buried in obscure datasets. It was a pattern visible clearly and consistently across decades of enforcement records, city by city, state by state, regardless of which political party happened to control local law enforcement priorities at any given time. Researchers and civil rights advocates pointed to a combination of factors driving this disparity, including policing strategies that concentrated resources disproportionately in lower-income, predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods, stop-and-frisk practices that disproportionately targeted young men of color, and sentencing guidelines that, even when nominally race-neutral in their written language, produced outcomes that were anything but neutral in practice. The consequences extended well beyond the moment of arrest itself. A cannabis conviction could trigger a cascade of secondary penalties, sometimes referred to by legal scholars as collateral consequences, affecting eligibility for public housing, federal financial aid for college, professional licensing in certain fields and in many states, voting rights during and sometimes well after any period of incarceration. These consequences compounded across generations in communities already grappling with concentrated poverty and limited economic mobility, creating self-reinforcing cycles that critics argued functioned as a form of social control considerably more effective and considerably more insidious than anything achieved through the actual criminal penalties themselves. Michelle Alexander's influential book, The New Jim Crow, published in 2010, argued forcefully that the war on drugs, cannabis enforcement very much included, functioned as a direct successor to earlier systems of racial control in American history, a thesis that generated substantial public debate, but also considerable supporting evidence drawn directly from the enforcement statistics accumulated over the preceding decades. By the time individual states began seriously considering legalization in the 2010s, this civil rights dimension had become impossible to separate from the broader policy conversation. Legalization advocates increasingly frame their arguments not solely around personal freedom or economic opportunity, but explicitly around addressing decades of documented, statistically overwhelming racial disparity in enforcement, This shift in framing would go on to directly shape the design of numerous state legalization programs, many of which eventually incorporated specific provisions addressing expungement of past convictions and equitable access to the emerging legal cannabis industry for communities that had borne the brunt of prohibition enforcement for generations, an attempt, however imperfect and however delayed, to reckon with a pattern that the data had been quietly documenting all along. The Reagan years brought a fresh wave of anti-cannabis messaging, wrapped in catchy slogans and after-school specials that somehow made the plant seem simultaneously terrifying and hilarious. Nancy Reagan launched the Just Say No campaign in 1982, a public awareness effort aimed primarily at children and teenagers, encouraging them to simply refuse drugs when offered, a strategy that assumed peer pressure alone explained most substance use and that a catchy slogan might function as an adequate countermeasure. The campaign expanded rapidly, incorporating school assemblies, television public service announcements, and an entire curriculum eventually formalized into the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, commonly known as DARE, which brought uniformed police officers directly into elementary and middle school classrooms across the country to deliver anti-drug messaging to children as young as 10 years old. Popular media of the era leaned heavily into dramatic, frequently exaggerated depictions of drug use and its consequences. Television specials warned of drug-fueled tragedy with an intensity that occasionally veered into genuinely bizarre territory, and one particularly memorable 1980s public service announcement featured an egg being cracked into a frying pan, accompanied by narration comparing the sizzling egg to what drugs supposedly did to your brain, an analogy that generations of viewers would go on to remember more for its unintentional comedy than for any lasting behavioural impact. This is the era, some historians argue, in which the government's fight against drugs began drifting most visibly away from evidence-based public health messaging and into pure spectacle, an approach considerably more concerned with generating a strong emotional reaction than with providing young people accurate information about relative risk. Researchers studying the actual effectiveness of these campaigns in the years that followed found the results considerably underwhelming. Multiple long-term studies evaluating the DARE program specifically found little to no measurable reduction in actual drug use among participants compared to students who never went through the program, and some analyses even suggested the program's dramatic framing occasionally backfired, generating curiosity rather than deterrence among the very teenagers it was designed to reach. None of this dampened the political momentum behind the campaign at the time. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, passed during the same period, introduced the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines discussed earlier, meaning the Just Say No era wasn't simply a matter of catchy slogans and awkward classroom assemblies. It coincided directly with and helped provide political cover for one of the most aggressive expansions of drug-related criminal penalties in American history. Federal funding for anti-drug messaging and enforcement expanded considerably throughout the decade, and cannabis, despite representing a considerably less severe public health concern than crack cocaine, which was simultaneously devastating many urban communities during this exact period, remained lumped together within the same broad enforcement and messaging framework, treated with rhetorical intensity that rarely distinguished meaningfully between substances with dramatically different risk profiles. Looking back, the Just Say No era occupies a strange cultural space, remembered today with almost as much amusement at its stylistic excess as concern about its actual policy consequences, even though those consequences, in terms of incarceration rates and sentencing severity, proved considerably more lasting and considerably less funny than the frying pan egg commercial ever managed to be. In 1996, California became the first state to legalize medical cannabis, opening a door that federal law would spend the next 2 decades pretending wasn't actually open. Proposition 215, also known as the Compassionate Use Act, passed by California voters in November of that year, allowed patients with a physician's recommendation to legally possess and use cannabis for qualifying medical conditions, including cancer, AIDS, chronic pain, and several other serious illnesses. This wasn't simply a policy change, it represented the first significant legislative crack in a wall of prohibition that had stood largely unchallenged at the state level for roughly 6 decades. The campaign behind Proposition 215 drew heavily on patient testimony, particularly from individuals living with AIDS and cancer, who described cannabis as one of the few substances effectively managing symptoms like severe nausea and appetite loss that conventional medication struggled to address, testimony that proved considerably more persuasive to voters than decades of federal warnings had managed to be. The measure passed with 56% of the vote, a clear majority that surprised many political observers who had assumed cannabis reform remained too politically toxic for mainstream electoral success. What followed was a period of genuine legal chaos, as California's new state law collided directly with continued federal prohibition under the Controlled Substances Act. Federal authorities, including the Drug Enforcement Administration, continued raiding California's dispensaries and prosecuting cannabis providers throughout the following decade, arguing that state legalization carried no weight against federal law, creating a bizarre situation in which patients and providers operating in full compliance with California state law could still find themselves facing federal criminal charges. This tension reached the Supreme Court in the 2005 case Gonzalez v. Raich, in which the court ruled that federal authority under the Commerce Clause allowed continued federal prosecution of medical cannabis users even in states where it had been legalized, a decision that left California's medical cannabis patients and providers in an unusually precarious legal position for years afterward. Despite this ongoing federal tension, California's example proved considerably more contagious than federal officials likely hoped. Other states began following relatively quickly, with Alaska, Oregon, and Washington all passing their own medical cannabis measures in 1998, and additional states continuing to join throughout the following decade. By the time Colorado and Washington moved toward full recreational legalization in 2012, a substantial majority of states had already established some form of legal medical cannabis program, meaning the country had spent roughly a decade and a half slowly, unevenly, state by state, building the legal and cultural infrastructure that recreational legalization would eventually build upon. What makes California's 1996 measure so significant in retrospect isn't simply that it was first, it's that it demonstrated, in a very public and electorally decisive way, that voters, when presented directly with patient stories and compassionate use arguments, rather than decades-old propaganda film rhetoric, were considerably more receptive to cannabis reform than generations of federal policy had assumed. The door had been forced open, even if the federal government spent the following 20 years acting as though it hadn't noticed. As medical programs expanded state by state, the humble drug dealer's corner hustle slowly transformed into a storefront with mood lighting, glass display cases, and surprisingly knowledgeable staff. In the years immediately following California's 1996 medical legalization, cannabis distribution operated in a considerably rougher, less regulated form than what would eventually emerge. Early dispensaries often existed in a legal grey zone, operating out of modest storefronts with minimal signage, relying heavily on word of mouth and cautious operators who understood they were navigating a landscape where federal raids remained a genuine ongoing risk throughout the 2000s. As more states adopted medical cannabis programs and regulatory frameworks matured, dispensaries began professionalizing considerably, adopting security systems, seed-to-sale, tracking software designed to satisfy state compliance requirements, and staff trained specifically to guide patients through an increasingly complex product landscape involving different strains, concentration levels, and consumption methods that would have been almost entirely unfamiliar to cannabis consumers just a decade or two earlier. The role of the bud tender emerged during this period as a genuinely new occupation, part salesperson, part informal educator, expected to explain the differences between indica and sativa strains, walk patients through dosing considerations for edibles, and generally serve as the primary point of consumer-facing expertise in an industry that had, quite suddenly, needed to develop professional standards essentially from scratch. This represented a dramatic cultural shift from the underground. Informal distribution networks that had defined cannabis access for decades prior. Where cannabis had once changed hands in alleyways, at concerts, or through carefully guarded personal networks, it was now, in states with mature medical programs, being purchased in retail environments that increasingly resembled upscale pharmacies or boutique retail shops, complete with polished countertops, informational packaging, and in some cases, genuinely sophisticated interior design intended to signal legitimacy and put anxious first-time patients at ease. Colorado's medical cannabis program, established in 2000, grew particularly robust throughout the following decade, and by the time the state moved toward full recreational legalization in 2012, it already possessed a mature, well-established dispensary infrastructure that provided a functional blueprint for the recreational market that would soon follow. This professionalization process also brought considerable economic activity with it, generating employment not just for bud tenders, but for cultivators, extraction technicians, compliance officers, and eventually marketing and branding specialists as the industry began competing for consumer attention in an increasingly crowded marketplace. States began collecting meaningful tax revenue from these operations as well, providing an economic argument for legalization that would prove increasingly persuasive to lawmakers in additional states weighing their own potential programs. What's particularly notable about this transitional period is how thoroughly it normalized the retail cannabis experience for an entire generation of consumers, particularly medical patients who might never have felt comfortable purchasing cannabis through underground channels, but who found the clinical, professionalized dispensary environment considerably more approachable. By the time recreational legalization arrived in the following decade, the retail infrastructure, consumer expectations, and professional standards had already been quietly built, tested, and refined through more than 15 years of medical market operation, meaning the transition to recreational sales, when it finally came, had considerably more institutional groundwork supporting it than casual observers might have assumed. In 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize recreational cannabis, turning a plant once demonized in propaganda films into a taxable line item on a state budget spreadsheet. Colorado's Amendment 64 and Washington's Initiative 502 both passed in the November 2012 election, marking the first time any American jurisdiction had voted to fully legalize cannabis for adult recreational use, rather than simply decriminalizing possession or permitting medical access. Both measures established frameworks for licensed cultivation, processing, and retail sale, alongside taxation structures designed to generate state revenue, while attempting to undercut the illicit market through competitive, regulated pricing. Colorado's retail cannabis sales officially began on January 1, 2014, and the opening day drew lines outside licensed shops that stretched around city blocks, with some customers reportedly waiting hours in freezing temperatures simply to be among the first legal recreational cannabis purchases in modern American history. Local news coverage captured scenes that would have been genuinely unimaginable just a decade earlier. Customers walking out of storefronts with cannabis products in branded bags, receipts in hand, having just completed a transaction that remained, at that exact moment, still technically illegal under federal law occurring openly in broad daylight. The financial numbers that followed proved substantial enough to capture attention nationwide. Colorado generated tens of millions of dollars in cannabis tax revenue within its first year of recreational sales, with those figures climbing considerably higher in subsequent years, funding, among other things, school construction projects and public health initiatives, providing state officials with a concrete, easily communicated argument in favor of legalization that proved considerably more persuasive to skeptical lawmakers in other states than abstract civil liberties arguments alone had managed to be. Washington's rollout proceeded somewhat more cautiously, with retail sales beginning several months after Colorado's, but ultimately achieving similarly robust revenue outcomes as its regulatory framework matured. The federal government's response to these state-level developments proved notably restrained compared to the aggressive enforcement posture seen during California's earlier medical cannabis rollout. In August 2013, the Department of Justice issued what became known as the Cole Memorandum, outlining a policy of generally deferring to state regulatory frameworks, provided certain federal priorities, including preventing distribution to minors and preventing revenue from flowing to criminal organizations, were adequately addressed by state programs. This memo, while carrying no permanent legal force and later rescinded during a subsequent administration, provided enough practical breathing room for Colorado and Washington's programs to establish themselves and demonstrate viability without the kind of aggressive federal raids that had characterized California's medical cannabis experience over the preceding 15 years. Other states watched closely, and the results they observed, functioning markets, substantial tax revenue, and an absence of the widely predicted surge in youth usage rates or public safety crises, provided considerably more persuasive evidence than any amount of theoretical policy debate could have offered. Within just a few years, additional states began pursuing their own recreational legalization measures, and what had begun as a genuinely uncertain experiment in two relatively unassuming states quickly established itself as a viable, replicable model that would reshape cannabis policy across the country considerably faster than even many legalization advocates had originally anticipated. As legalization spread, cannabis attracted venture capital, branding consultants, and stock exchange listings, transforming an underground economy into an industry with quarterly earnings calls. Where cannabis distribution had once relied on informal networks and cautious cash transactions conducted with an eye toward avoiding law enforcement attention, the legal industry that emerged throughout the 2010s increasingly resembled any other consumer goods sector, complete with investor pitch decks, professional branding agencies, and executives with backgrounds in traditional retail and consumer packaged goods, rather than in the underground cannabis trade itself. Companies began appearing with names and packaging designed to appeal to a demographic considerably broader than the countercultural stereotype that had dominated public perception of cannabis consumers for decades, marketing products toward wellness, conscious professionals, athletes seeking recovery aids, and consumers who had never previously considered themselves cannabis users at all, but found themselves intrigued by increasingly sophisticated product lines ranging from precisely dosed edibles to elegantly packaged vape cartridges. Canadian cannabis companies moved particularly aggressively into public capital markets following that country's nationwide legalization in 2018, with firms like Canopy Growth and Aurora Cannabis achieving market valuations in the billions of dollars and securing listings on major stock exchanges, developments that would have seemed almost surreal to anyone familiar with cannabis's legal status just a decade or two earlier. American companies, constrained by continued federal illegality from accessing major national stock exchanges directly, found creative workarounds, including listing on Canadian exchanges or pursuing complex corporate structures designed to navigate the persistent gap between state legality and federal prohibition. Private equity and venture capital investment flowed into the sector throughout the mid to late 2010s, funding rapid expansion of cultivation facilities, retail chains and product development, with some investors treating the emerging legal cannabis market with the same enthusiasm typically reserved for promising technology startups. This corporate transformation brought considerable tension along with it. Longtime advocates and small-scale operators who had spent decades operating in the shadows, often at genuine personal legal risk, watched with mixed feelings as well-funded corporate entities, frequently led by executives with no prior connection to cannabis culture or activism, moved into the newly legal market with resources and regulatory navigation expertise that smaller, community-rooted operators simply couldn't match. Concerns emerged about consolidation, about whether the economic benefits of legalization would flow primarily to well-capitalized corporate newcomers rather than to the communities and individuals who had borne the brunt of prohibition enforcement for generations. A tension that would go on to directly influence how several states structured their licensing programs, with some specifically incorporating social equity provisions designed to ensure meaningful participation from communities disproportionately affected by past enforcement. Branding and marketing became genuinely sophisticated during this period as well, with companies investing in professional packaging design, wellness-oriented messaging, and celebrity partnerships that positioned cannabis products alongside premium consumer goods rather than alongside the illicit countercultural associations that had defined public perception for decades. What emerged by the end of the 2010s was an industry that, in its outward presentation at least, bore remarkably little resemblance to the underground economy it had grown out of, complete with industry trade shows, professional lobbying organizations, and quarterly financial reporting, even as the underlying federal legal contradiction that would complicate this corporate transformation continued sitting, largely unresolved, directly beneath the entire enterprise. Even as more states legalized cannabis, it remained federally illegal, creating a bizarre patchwork where a business could be entirely legal in one jurisdiction and a federal crime in the next. By the late 2010s, dozens of states had established some form of legal cannabis program, whether medical, recreational, or both, yet cannabis remained classified as a Schedule I substance under federal law, technically placing it in the same legal category as heroin, officially designated as having no accepted medical use, a classification that grew increasingly difficult to reconcile with the fact that millions of Americans were, at that exact moment, purchasing cannabis legally from state-licensed retail establishments. This contradiction created practical complications that extended well beyond abstract legal philosophy. Cannabis businesses operating in full compliance with state law found themselves unable to access basic banking services, since federally regulated banks remained understandably reluctant to provide accounts or loans to businesses engaged in what remained, from the federal government's perspective, ongoing drug trafficking. This left many legal cannabis businesses operating largely in cash, creating genuine security risks and considerable operational headaches for what were, in every other respect, licensed and regulated retail operations paying substantial state taxes. Federal tax law compounded the difficulty considerably. A provision known as Section 280E of the Federal Tax Code, originally written decades earlier to prevent drug traffickers from deducting business expenses, applied directly to state legal cannabis businesses, preventing them from deducting many standard operating costs that any other legal business would routinely claim, resulting in effective tax rates considerably higher than those faced by comparable non-cannabis businesses, an outcome that struck many industry participants as a particularly absurd example of outdated federal law colliding with new state-level reality. Interstate commerce presented its own set of contradictions. A cannabis company could operate legally within Colorado's borders, but faced federal trafficking charges if it attempted to transport product across state lines into another legal market, even one with an equally robust regulatory framework, meaning companies in different legal states couldn't simply expand operations the way businesses in virtually any other industry would, forcing considerable inefficiency and redundant infrastructure investment across state borders that made little practical sense from a business perspective, but remained federally mandated nonetheless. Employment law added further complications, as employees working entirely legally under state cannabis programs could still face consequences under federal employment contexts, and immigrants, even those working legally within state cannabis programs, risked serious immigration consequences since federal immigration law continued treating cannabis involvement as a disqualifying factor for various immigration benefits regardless of state legality. Congress made periodic attempts throughout this period to address at least some elements of this contradiction, including recurring legislative proposals aimed specifically at resolving the banking access problem, though comprehensive federal reform addressing the core scheduling contradiction itself proved considerably more politically difficult to achieve. Caught between genuine bipartisan movement toward reform on one hand, and lingering institutional caution within federal law enforcement and regulatory agencies on the other. This unresolved contradiction meant that for years, the legal cannabis industry existed in a kind of extended limbo, genuinely legal and heavily taxed at the state level, while remaining technically illegal at the federal level, an arrangement that satisfied essentially no one involved, and that industry advocates, state officials, and even some federal lawmakers increasingly described as an unsustainable long-term arrangement requiring eventual resolution, even as the practical work of actually resolving it continued moving at a pace considerably slower than the industry itself had grown. Somewhere along the way, cannabis rebranded itself from countercultural rebellion into wellness aisle respectability, complete with CBD gummies sold beside vitamins. Walk into a grocery store, a pharmacy, or even certain gas stations in many parts of the country today, and you will likely find CBD-infused products sitting on shelves next to protein powder and multivitamins, marketed with clean, minimalist packaging and language borrowed heavily from the broader wellness industry, emphasizing relaxation, recovery, and balance, rather than anything resembling the countercultural rebellion that once defined cannabis's public image. This shift reflects a broader transformation in how cannabis, and particularly its non-intoxicating compound cannabidiol, commonly known as CBD, has been marketed and consumed following the 2018 Farm Bill, which federally legalized hemp-derived products containing minimal amounts of the psychoactive compound THC, effectively opening an entirely new legal marketplace almost overnight. CBD oils, topical creams, and edibles proliferated rapidly following this legislative change, marketed toward consumers seeking relief from anxiety, chronic pain, or sleep difficulties, often presented with the same understated clinical branding language you might find on any conventional over-the-counter supplement, a striking contrast to the psychedelic countercultural imagery that had dominated cannabis marketing for decades prior. Athletes and celebrities increasingly began publicly endorsing cannabis and CBD products for recovery and wellness purposes, a development that would have been almost unthinkable just a decade or two earlier, given the strict anti-doping policies most professional sports leagues maintained around cannabis use. Some professional sports organizations gradually loosened their own testing policies during this period, acknowledging growing evidence around cannabis's potential role in pain management as an alternative to opioid-based treatments. a shift that reflected broader cultural movement away from viewing cannabis primarily through a criminal lens and toward viewing it as a legitimate component of health and recovery routines. The wellness industry more broadly embraced cannabis and its derivative compounds with considerable enthusiasm, incorporating them into spa treatments, skincare lines, and even high-end dining experiences featuring cannabis-infused menus in states where such offerings were legally permitted. This rebranding effort proved remarkably successful at reaching demographics that had previously shown little interest in cannabis, including older consumers seeking alternatives to prescription medications for chronic pain and anxiety, and professionals concerned about maintaining a respectable public image who found the wellness framing considerably more comfortable than the countercultural associations of previous decades. Marketing language shifted accordingly, favouring words like balance, mindfulness, and self-care over anything referencing the plant's history of rebellion or countercultural identity, a linguistic transformation almost as dramatic as the shift from cannabis to marijuana that had occurred nearly a century earlier, except this time moving in precisely the opposite direction, softening rather than criminalizing the substance's public image. Critics of this wellness rebranding have raised valid concerns about oversimplified health claims outpacing actual scientific evidence in certain product categories, and regulatory oversight of this rapidly expanding CBD marketplace has, in places, struggled to keep pace with the sheer volume and variety of products flooding into stores. Still, the broader cultural shift is difficult to deny. A substance once depicted in government-sponsored films as a one-way ticket to axe murder and manic piano playing now sits, quite literally, on the same store shelf as your multivitamin, marketed to the exact demographic that decades of federal propaganda had once been most aggressively designed to frighten away from it entirely. Even as legal cannabis booms, millions of people still carry criminal records for offences that are now legal business models in the very same states, leaving the story of cannabis history still very much unresolved. As state after state moved toward legalization throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s, a particularly uncomfortable irony became impossible to ignore. Individuals continued serving prison sentences or living with the lasting consequences of past convictions for cannabis-related offences that were, at that exact moment, being conducted entirely legally by licensed businesses operating openly within the very same state borders. This contradiction spurred a growing expungement movement, with advocates arguing that legalization without corresponding relief for those previously convicted represented, at best, an incomplete reckoning with decades of aggressive and disproportionately enforced prohibition. Several states began incorporating automatic or streamlined expungement provisions directly into their legalization legislation, recognizing that requiring individuals to navigate complex, costly legal processes to clear records for conduct the state itself no longer considered criminal placed an unfair burden on exactly the communities that had already borne the heaviest weight of prohibition enforcement throughout the preceding decades. California, Illinois, and several other states implemented automatic expungement systems designed to clear qualifying cannabis convictions without requiring individuals to file petitions or hire attorneys, processing hundreds of thousands of records in some cases, though implementation proved considerably slower and more logistically complicated in practice than the legislation's language sometimes suggested, with backlogs, inconsistent record-keeping across different court systems, and funding shortfalls slowing the pace of actual relief considerably below what advocates had originally hoped for. Social equity provisions became an increasingly common feature of newer state legalization frameworks as well, with several states establishing licensing programs specifically designed to prioritize applicants from communities disproportionately affected by past cannabis enforcement, including provisions offering reduced licensing fees, dedicated funding, or priority application review for qualifying applicants. These programs have produced genuinely mixed results in practice. Some have successfully helped launch minority-owned cannabis businesses that might otherwise have struggled to compete against better capitalized corporate entrants, while others have faced criticism for bureaucratic delays, legal challenges, or insufficient funding that left many intended beneficiaries unable to actually access the promised opportunities in practice. At the federal level, comprehensive reform addressing both scheduling and broader criminal justice consequences has moved considerably slower than state-level action, with various legislative proposals introduced repeatedly over the years without achieving the sustained bipartisan momentum needed for passage, even as public opinion polling has shown growing majority support for federal legalization across a wide range of political affiliations. The gap between rapidly expanding state-level commercial legalization and the comparatively sluggish pace of criminal justice relief for past convictions remains one of the more unresolved tensions running through this entire modern chapter of cannabis history. It raises a question that continues to sit, largely unanswered, at the center of the broader legalization movement. What does genuine justice look like for the millions of people whose lives were permanently altered by convictions for conduct now generating tax revenue and employing thousands of people in storefronts just down the street from where their own arrests once took place? The plant's legal status changed considerably faster than the systems built to address the human cost of criminalizing it in the first place. And that gap, more than perhaps any other single detail in this entire history, remains cannabis's most unfinished chapter. In ancient India, cannabis wasn't hiding in back alleys. It was mixed into a ceremonial drink called bhang, blessed by priests tied to the god Shiva himself, and consumed with a level of religious enthusiasm that modern lawmakers would later find deeply inconvenient. Bhang, a preparation made by grinding cannabis leaves and flowers into a paste and blending it with milk, ghee, sugar, and a rotating cast of regional spices depending on which part of the subcontinent you happen to be standing in, appears in Indian religious and cultural practice stretching back thousands of years, referenced in the Atharva Veda as one of 5 sacred plants granted to humanity, positioned alongside staples considered essential to daily and spiritual life. This wasn't a fringe practice confined to isolated ascetics wandering the countryside with nothing better to do. Bhang became deeply woven into mainstream religious festivals, most notably Holi, the vibrant spring festival of colours celebrated across India, during which bhang consumption remains a widely accepted, culturally sanctioned tradition to this day in many regions, consumed openly by celebrants of all ages as part of the festivities, rather than treated as any kind of scandalous indulgence requiring secrecy or shame. Imagine an entire nationally beloved holiday that essentially amounts to throwing coloured powder at your neighbours while sipping a ceremonial cannabis milkshake, and you have a rough sense of just how normalised this practice became over the centuries. A stark contrast to the furtive back alley energy the same plant would eventually pick up on the other side of the world. The connection to Shiva runs particularly deep throughout Hindu religious tradition. Shiva is frequently depicted and described in religious texts as an ascetic deity closely associated with cannabis, sometimes referred to by devotional titles translating roughly to Lord of Bhang, and devotees have offered cannabis at Shiva temples for centuries as part of religious ritual, viewing the plant not as an intoxicant to be shamefully hidden, but as a substance capable of aiding meditation, facilitating spiritual insight, and honouring divine tradition passed down through countless generations of worship. Sadhus, wandering Hindu ascetics who renounce worldly possessions in pursuit of spiritual enlightenment, have historically used cannabis as part of their meditative practice, smoking it from a traditional clay pipe called a chillum, often as part of elaborate ritual gatherings that combined chanting, fasting and communal smoking sessions meant to strip away worldly distraction and bring the practitioner closer to some deeper spiritual truth. This practice has been documented by travellers, colonial administrators, and religious scholars for centuries, and in modified form it continues among certain ascetic communities even today, particularly around major religious gatherings like the Kumbh Mela, where sadhus can still be seen openly smoking cannabis as an accepted part of their spiritual observance, while thousands of pilgrims pass by without so much as a raised eyebrow. This religious and cultural embedding created a genuinely unusual legal situation. Once European colonial powers and later international drug treaties negotiated throughout the 20th century began pushing toward global cannabis prohibition, India found itself attempting to reconcile mounting international pressure towards strict criminalization with centuries of deeply rooted religious and cultural tradition surrounding Bhang specifically, a tension that resulted in India's own domestic cannabis law, the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act, carving out specific carve-outs and regional exceptions for Bhang consumption that persist in various forms to this day, even as other cannabis preparations, particularly resin-based products like charas and ganja, remain more strictly regulated under the country's broader drug control framework. Individual states within India have historically maintained their own licensing systems for bhang shops, government-sanctioned retail outlets where the preparation can be purchased legally, an arrangement that would strike most Western observers as almost surreally contradictory given how aggressively the rest of the cannabis plant family gets policed under the very same national legal code. This is a genuinely fascinating historical thread because it demonstrates just how differently cannabis could be treated depending entirely on cultural and religious context, rather than any consistent underlying pharmacological logic applied evenly across substances. The same plant that Western nations would eventually criminalize under increasingly severe penalties, framing it as morally corrosive and socially dangerous enough to warrant decades in prison, had spent thousands of years in India being poured into ceremonial cups, blessed by priests, sold at government license shops, and consumed openly at religious festivals attended by families across the entire social spectrum, from wealthy merchants to humble farmers. There was no moral panic here, no black and white propaganda film, no congressional hearing demanding tearful testimony about axe murders and jazz clubs. There was simply a plant treated as sacred, integrated into religious practice with the same seriousness and reverence, typically reserved for anything else considered a genuine gift from the divine, a tradition that continued largely undisturbed for millennia until an entirely different set of geopolitical and colonial pressures eventually arrived, tangled up with treaties and trade politics that had considerably less to do with Shiva and considerably more to do with which nations happened to be drafting international drug policy at any given moment. While Harry Anslinger supplied the outrage, newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst supplied the megaphone, running sensationalized headlines that linked cannabis to violence and moral collapse, with the same restraint Hearst brought to everything else, which is to say, none at all. Hearst controlled one of the largest and most influential newspaper empires in American history throughout the early 20th century, with papers reaching millions of readers across major cities, and his publications had already established a well-documented reputation for sensationalized, occasionally outright fabricated coverage designed primarily to sell copies rather than inform readers accurately. This particular style of journalism proved so notorious that it eventually earned its own descriptive term, yellow journalism, a label historians trace directly back to the aggressive circulation battles Hearst waged with rival publisher Joseph Pulitzer decades earlier. a rivalry that had already taught Hearst everything he needed to know about the commercial power of a genuinely alarming headline. When it came to marijuana coverage throughout the 1920s and 30s, Hearst's papers embraced this sensationalist approach with particular enthusiasm, running front-page stories that linked marijuana use to violent crime, insanity, and moral degeneracy, frequently featuring lurid, dramatically embellished anecdotes that bore only passing resemblance to any actual verified events, sourced loosely from police reports, second-hand rumour, or in some documented cases, apparently invented from whole cloth by writers under pressure to deliver copy dramatic enough to justify front-page placement. Historians examining this period have pointed to several possible motivations behind Hearst's particular enthusiasm for anti-marijuana coverage, and the theories tend to overlap rather than compete with one another. Hearst held substantial investments in the timber and paper industries, and some historical analysis has suggested that hemp, which could theoretically be processed into paper using methods that some advocates argued were more efficient than wood pulp processing in certain applications, may have represented a potential economic competitor to interests Hearst had significant financial stakes in, though the extent to which this specifically motivated his editorial coverage remains genuinely debated among historians, rather than definitively proven with hard documentary evidence linking cause to effect. What is considerably less debated is the racial framing that ran consistently and unmistakably throughout Hearst's marijuana coverage during this period. His papers frequently connected marijuana use explicitly to Mexican immigrant communities, and in various pieces to Black Americans as well, employing language steeped in the same racial anxiety that characterized much of the broader prohibition campaign happening simultaneously at the federal level under Anslinger's direction, sometimes running headlines that read less like journalism and more like the sort of rhetoric you'd expect from a political pamphlet, with considerably less regard for factual accuracy. Hearst and Anslinger's efforts, whether formally coordinated behind closed doors or simply aligned through shared cultural prejudice and mutual political convenience, reinforced each other considerably throughout this critical decade, with Anslinger's alarmist congressional testimony providing exactly the kind of dramatic material Hearst's papers loved to amplify into front-page headlines, and Hearst's sensationalized coverage in turn providing Anslinger with exactly the kind of manufactured public alarm he needed to justify continued and expanding federal enforcement budgets year after year. The circular relationship between government fear-mongering and sensationalized press coverage during this era represents an early, particularly well-documented example of how manufactured moral panic could be constructed and amplified through the combined efforts of a motivated federal bureaucrat and a media empire more interested in dramatic headlines than careful fact-checking or editorial restraint. Readers throughout the 1920s and 30s encountered marijuana coverage in Hearst papers that described the substance in terms considerably more appropriate to describing a violent contagion sweeping through the nation than an agricultural product that had, just decades earlier, been sitting quietly in pharmacy bottles. Given the sheer reach and influence of Hearst's publishing empire at the time, spanning dozens of major newspapers across the country, and reaching an enormous cross-section of the American reading public, this coverage genuinely shaped public perception, and by extension political willingness to support increasingly aggressive prohibition legislation throughout this critical decade of cannabis policy formation. It is a sobering reminder that public panic, even when built on considerably shaky evidentiary foundations and occasionally outright invention, can prove remarkably durable and consequential once it finds a media apparatus willing and financially motivated to amplify it. A lesson that cannabis history illustrates with particular, extensively documented, and enduring clarity, one front-page headline at a time. By the 1970s, Cannabis had found an unlikely ambassador in the form of two disorganized comedians whose entire cinematic output amounted to a decades-long argument that maybe, just maybe, weed wasn't quite the axe murder catalyst the propaganda films promised. Richard Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong began performing together as a comedy duo in the late 1960s, developing a stage act built around characters who were affable, perpetually confused, and almost constitutionally incapable of accomplishing even the simplest tasks without some cannabis-related mishap derailing the entire endeavour in increasingly absurd fashion. Their stage act translated well to vinyl comedy albums before eventually making the leap to film, and their first movie, Up in Smoke, released in 1978, became a surprise commercial success, grossing considerably more than its modest production budget and establishing an entire subgenre of comedy built around cannabis culture that would continue producing sequels and imitators for decades afterward, well past the point anyone could have reasonably predicted at the outset. What made Cheech and Chong's comedic approach so culturally significant wasn't simply that they made jokes about smoking cannabis, since plenty of comedians before them had made passing references without building an entire career around the premise. It was the specific tone they brought to the material, presenting their characters as harmless, likeable, fundamentally good-natured people, whose cannabis use resulted in silly misadventures, mistaken identities, and elaborate escapes from mildly incompetent authority figures rather than violent crime sprees or moral collapse. A direct and almost gleeful tonal rebuttal to decades of government-sponsored messaging that had insisted the exact opposite outcome was not just possible but likely. Audiences responded enthusiastically, and the duo's films performed well enough commercially to spawn a series of sequels throughout the late 70s and into the 80s, including Cheech and Chong's next movie A Nice Dreams, cementing stoner comedy as a genuinely viable and commercially successful film genre, rather than a fringe curiosity destined to disappear after a single successful release. This cultural shift mattered considerably beyond simple entertainment value and box office receipts. For an entire generation of young Americans who'd grown up watching Reefer Madness-style scare tactics gradually lose credibility against their own lived experience and that of their peers, none of whom seemed to be committing manslaughter or descending into piano-fueled psychosis after a single joint, Cheech and Chong offered a comedic counter-narrative that felt considerably more relatable and considerably less absurd than decades of government messaging had managed to be. The characters weren't heroic or aspirational in any traditional cinematic sense. They were bumbling, occasionally lazy, chronically disorganized, but ultimately harmless, and that specific characterization, more than any political argument or peer-reviewed scientific study, circulating quietly in academic journals, did considerable work in reshaping how mainstream American audiences visualize the typical cannabis user, replacing the axe-wielding maniac of 1930s propaganda with a considerably more relatable and considerably funnier archetype. Critics at the time were frequently dismissive of the film's artistic merits, viewing them as lowbrow entertainment lacking any serious cinematic ambition, and to be fair, the films themselves rarely aspired to anything beyond broad comedic entertainment built around slapstick wordplay and an impressive commitment to never once taking their own premise seriously. But their cultural influence proved considerably more durable than most critics anticipated at the time, establishing comedic tropes, visual gags, and character archetypes that would echo through cannabis-related media for decades to come, influencing later films, television shows, and comedy specials that continued mining similar comedic territory well into the 2000s and beyond, from stoner buddy comedies to entire television series built around a similar comedic premise. Cheech and Chong themselves became, somewhat unexpectedly given their disreputable comedic origins, genuine cultural icons rather than simply a passing comedic fad tied to one particular decade. They continued touring and performing together intermittently for decades afterward, occasionally reuniting for new projects, and eventually found themselves treated with a kind of affectionate cultural reverence by audiences who had grown up on their films and now viewed them as beloved elder statesmen of an entire comedic tradition, rather than the disreputable troublemakers earlier critics had once dismissed them as being. It is a strange, genuinely American trajectory, watching two comedians build an entire multi-decade career, complete with albums, films, and eventually their own branded cannabis products decades later, out of gently mocking exactly the moral panic that had, just a few decades earlier, criminalized the very substance their entire comedic identity revolved around. For decades, professional athletes faced suspensions and public shame for cannabis use, until leagues slowly, almost reluctantly, began rewriting their rulebooks as the definition of performance enhancing versus recovery aiding got a long overdue second look. Major professional sports leagues in the United States implemented strict anti-cannabis testing policies throughout the latter half of the 20th century, treating cannabis use with essentially the same seriousness as performance-enhancing steroids. Despite the fact that cannabis offers no obvious competitive advantage in most athletic contexts, and, if anything, tends to work against the kind of explosive physical performance these policies were ostensibly designed to prevent through banned substance regulation in the first place. High-profile suspensions throughout the 1990s and 2000s brought this policy tension into public view repeatedly, with athletes across multiple sports facing significant suspensions, substantial fines, and considerable public relations damage over positive cannabis tests, often for use that occurred well outside of competition, during genuine off-season downtime, and had no plausible connection to any actual competitive advantage during games or events themselves. Snowboarder Ross Ribagliati's case at the 1998 Winter Olympics became one of the most widely discussed early examples of this policy confusion playing out on an international stage, when he initially had his gold medal stripped following a positive cannabis test, generating international headlines and considerable embarrassment, before having the medal reinstated just days later after Olympic officials determined cannabis wasn't actually on the official banned substance list for that particular competition at the time. A legal technicality that spared him, but that highlighted just how confused and inconsistently applied cannabis policy remained across different sporting organizations, even at the highest international competitive levels. As scientific understanding of cannabis's actual physiological effects evolved considerably throughout the following 2 decades, and as growing clinical evidence pointed toward its potential usefulness for pain management and post-competition recovery, an alternative that carried considerably less risk of the severe addiction and overdose potential associated with opioid painkillers many athletes had traditionally relied on for managing chronic injury. Pain accumulated over years of physical competition. Several leagues began seriously reconsidering their testing policies throughout the 2010s. The National Football League, National Basketball Association, and Major League Baseball all made meaningful adjustments to their cannabis testing and penalty structures during this period, generally moving toward reduced penalties for positive tests, significantly higher THC thresholds required before triggering an official positive result, or eliminating cannabis testing during the official off-season entirely. Changes that reflected both evolving scientific understanding within team medical staffs and the broader wave of state-level legalization that had, by this point, made strict cannabis prohibition policies increasingly difficult to justify or consistently enforce, given how many jurisdictions where these leagues actually operated had already legalized the substance at the state level for adult recreational or medical use. Individual athletes became increasingly vocal advocates for this policy shift as well, with several retired and active players publicly discussing their own use of cannabis for managing chronic pain from years of physical competition, framing it explicitly and repeatedly as a safer alternative to the prescription opioid painkillers that had contributed to well-documented, tragically extensive addiction crises among former professional athletes across multiple sports, some of whom had gone on to describe their opioid dependency in considerably more damaging terms than they ever used to describe cannabis. This advocacy helped shift both public and institutional perception considerably, moving cannabis discourse within professional sports away from simple prohibition enforcement and toward a more nuanced, medically informed conversation about pain management, injury recovery, and long-term athlete health more broadly, one that increasingly treated cannabis as a legitimate clinical tool rather than a banned substance requiring automatic suspension. By the early 2020s, several leagues had moved toward policies that would have seemed almost unimaginable just 2 decades earlier, effectively normalizing cannabis use among athletes in a way that closely mirrored the broader cultural and legal normalization happening simultaneously across American society at large. This particular shift took considerably longer to arrive in professional sports than in many other sectors of American life, hampered by institutional caution, international competition rules, and lingering concerns about public image. But it arrived nonetheless, carried along by the same accumulating weight of scientific evidence, changing public opinion and state-level legal reality, reshaping cannabis policy in nearly every other corner of American culture during the same extended period. As legalization campaigns picked up steam, an unlikely coalition of aging outlaws, rap icons, and country legends became the public face of the movement, proving that sometimes the best lobbyists wear tie-dye and have their own branded rolling papers. Willie Nelson, the country music legend whose public association with cannabis stretches back decades to his earliest touring years, became one of the most recognizable and consistently vocal celebrity advocates for legalization throughout the latter half of the 20th century and well into the 21st, openly discussing his cannabis use in countless interviews with a relaxed, matter-of-fact candor that helped normalize the entire conversation for an entire generation of fans who might otherwise have viewed cannabis through a considerably more suspicious and skeptical lens, particularly given Nelson's wholesome, folksy public image across 5 decades of country music stardom. Nelson's advocacy extended well beyond simple public discussion in magazine profiles and late-night interviews. He co-founded Willie's Reserve, a cannabis brand launched in the mid-2010s designed to capitalize on his decades of cultural association with the plant, while also supporting legalization advocacy more broadly, effectively transforming his personal brand into a genuine business venture within the emerging legal industry, complete with product lines named after his own songs and a business philosophy explicitly built around supporting small farmers and local growers rather than large corporate consolidation. Snoop Dogg, whose entire public persona has incorporated cannabis culture since his emergence as a major rap artist in the early 1990s, similarly transitioned from simply referencing cannabis in his music and public appearances toward becoming a genuine entrepreneur within the legal industry, launching his own cannabis brand called Leafs by Snoop in 2015, one of the earliest celebrity-branded cannabis products to enter the newly legal Colorado market, and later expanding into media ventures specifically covering cannabis culture and industry news through his own production company, effectively building an entire secondary career around an association he had maintained consistently and unapologetically since his very first album. These celebrity endorsements carried genuine political and cultural weight beyond their obvious commercial value as branding exercises. when widely recognized, generally beloved public figures spoke openly about their cannabis use without shame or apology, framing it as simply one part of a full, successful creative life, rather than as evidence of moral failing or criminal tendency, it provided a considerably more relatable and persuasive counter-narrative to decades of government messaging than any policy paper or peer-reviewed scientific study could achieve on its own, no matter how methodologically sound that research happened to be. Other celebrities followed similar paths throughout the 2010s, including numerous actors, musicians, and even some more conservative-leaning public figures who began publicly supporting legalization on libertarian or states' rights grounds rather than countercultural ones, broadening the political coalition supporting reform considerably beyond its traditional base and demonstrating that cannabis legalization had become a genuinely mainstream bipartisan adjacent position rather than a fringe countercultural demand confined to one particular political tribe. Legalization advocacy organizations recognized and actively leveraged this celebrity influence throughout various state ballot initiative campaigns, understanding that a supportive comment from a widely beloved figure like Willie Nelson could shift public opinion among demographics, particularly older, more socially conservative voters that might otherwise remain deeply skeptical of legalization arguments framed in more academic or policy-focused language borrowed from criminal justice reform circles. The financial dimension mattered considerably too, as celebrity-branded cannabis products helped legitimize the retail cannabis experience for mainstream consumers who might feel considerably more comfortable purchasing a product branded by a familiar, trusted cultural figure than navigating an unfamiliar dispensary environment without any recognizable reference point to ease that initial anxiety. By the time recreational legalization had spread across a majority of American states, this celebrity-fueled cultural mainstreaming had done considerable work alongside the legal, scientific, and economic arguments driving the broader legalization movement forward, demonstrating that changing hearts and minds sometimes required not just policy papers and carefully worded ballot initiatives, but also a country music legend calmly explaining, in interview after interview across 5 decades and multiple generations of fans, that this particular plant had simply been part of his life the whole time, and everything, by any reasonable measure, had turned out just fine. So here you are, drifting somewhere between the ancient temples of the Indus Valley and the fluorescent glow of a modern dispensary, having spent the last little while wandering through nearly 5,000 years of one plant's remarkably chaotic relationship with human civilization. And what a journey it's been. You watch Chinese physicians grind cannabis seeds into medicine with the same clinical calm they brought to ginger root. You watch Scythian warriors howl with delight inside smoke-filled tents, and you watched ancient Egyptians apply it gently to sore, tired eyes millennia before anyone thought to write a warning label. There was no shame in any of it, no moral crusade, no grainy black and white film insisting that one puff would send you sprinting toward a rooftop with an axe. It was simply a plant, doing what useful plants have always done, quietly working its way into the daily rhythms of whichever civilization happened to be paying attention. And then, gradually, almost sneakily, the story changed. You watched colonial farmers grow it because the law demanded it, not because anyone found it dangerous, and you watched Queen Victoria's own physician recommend it for cramps with the same straightforward confidence he might use for a headache powder. For a good long while, this plant sat comfortably on pharmacy shelves next to cough syrup, entirely respectable, entirely unremarkable, minding its own business in a small glass bottle with a neatly printed label. It is almost funny, in a quiet, dry sort of way, to think about how ordinary it once was. No hushed tones, no glancing over a shoulder before purchasing it. Just a woman walking into a shop, asking for something for her aching back, and walking out with exactly what she needed, no different than picking up flour or thread. But somewhere along the way, and you watched this happen too, a word arrived. Marijuana. Not a new plant, not a new danger, just a new word, attached deliberately to people society had already decided to fear, and suddenly an old, familiar substance became something else entirely in the public imagination. You watched one ambitious bureaucrat, freshly unemployed from enforcing an entirely different prohibition, find in this plant a convenient new enemy, one he could shape and exaggerate and parade in front of Congress, until an entire nation believed things about a common garden plant that simply were not true. You watched a newspaper empire amplify every one of his claims into front-page headlines, not because the claims held up under scrutiny, but because fear sells papers considerably better than nuance ever has. And you watched a black-and-white film convince a generation that a single joint led inevitably to hit-and-run manslaughter and a nervous breakdown at the piano, which, when you actually sit with it, is one of the more delightfully absurd chapters in the entire strange history of American moral panic. From there, you watch the consequences pile up, and this is where the story stops being quite so funny. You watched a tax law, dressed up in the dullest possible bureaucratic language, quietly criminalize a substance that had been sitting on pharmacy shelves just a generation earlier. You watched jazz clubs in Harlem become targets, not because of the music, but because of who was making it. Watched the beats scribble their way into a slightly more honest cultural conversation. Watched an entire generation in the 1960s turn cannabis into something closer to a flag than a plant. You watched Richard Nixon's own hand-picked commission tell him, in careful, well-researched detail, that the harshness of prohibition was doing more damage than the plant itself ever could, and you watched him set that report aside anyway, because by then the political machinery built around fear had grown too large and too useful to dismantle over something as inconvenient as evidence. And then came the truly heavy years. You watched prisons fill, watched sentencing laws strip judges of the discretion they might have used to temper an obviously disproportionate punishment, watched families separated over amounts of a plant that, within just a few decades, entire state governments would be taxing and selling through storefronts with mood lighting and friendly, knowledgeable staff. You watched the weight of all this fall unevenly, landing hardest on the very communities that had been targeted with suspicion from the very beginning, back when the word itself was first weaponized. That particular thread of the story does not resolve neatly. It sits there, unfinished, even now, even as legal cannabis generates tax revenue for schools and roads in the same states where people still carry the permanent record of a conviction for doing exactly what a licensed shop down the street now does legally every single day. History, it turns out, rarely wraps itself up in a tidy bow, and this one certainly hasn't. But alongside all of that heaviness, you also watch something stubbornly human keep pushing through, the same way it always seems to. You watch two disorganized comedians build an entire career out of gently, hilariously proving the propaganda films wrong, one bumbling misadventure at a time. You watched a country music legend calmly discuss his own use in interview after interview, until an entire skeptical demographic softened just a little around the edges. You watched dispensaries evolve from cautious storefronts operating in legal grey zones into polished retail spaces with better lighting than most banks. You watched a plant once poured ceremonially into a sacred drink for a Hindu festival, blessed by priests centuries before anyone dreamed up a drug schedule, quietly continue that same tradition largely undisturbed, a reminder that panic is not universal, that an entirely different culture managed to hold this same plant with reverence rather than fear for thousands of uninterrupted years. There is something worth sitting with in that contrast. The very same chemical compound, extracted from the very same plant, spent decades classified in America alongside heroin, treated as having no medical value whatsoever, while millions of people quietly used it anyway, in states that eventually simply changed the law to match the reality that had been sitting there in plain sight the whole time. It makes you wonder how much of history in the end isn't really about the thing itself at all, but about who gets blamed for it, who gets to write the headlines, and who gets left holding the consequences long after the panic itself has quietly faded into something closer to embarrassment. And yet, here we are, tonight, at the end of that long and winding road. A plant that travelled from ancient Chinese medicine chests to Scythian funeral tents, from Victorian pharmacy shelves to Harlem jazz clubs, from a rushed and evidence-starved congressional hearing to a Colorado sidewalk lined with customers waiting patiently in the cold for the chance to buy it legally for the very first time in their lives. It survived propaganda films, survived a war fought explicitly against it, survived decades of mandatory minimum sentences, and somehow, through all of that, it ended up back roughly where it started thousands of years earlier, viewed by a great many people as simply medicine, simply a plant, simply something that grows in the ground and occasionally helps a person feel a little more at ease. So as you drift off tonight, wrapped in whatever blanket you've chosen, in whatever quiet room you happen to be in, maybe spare a small sleepy thought for everyone tangled up in this particular story. Spare a thought for the ancient Chinese physicians who simply wrote it down as medicine and moved on to the next remedy without a second thought. Spare a thought for the Scythian warriors, howling with genuine delight in their felt tents, utterly unbothered by any of the moral hand-wringing that would eventually follow their custom by a couple thousand years. Spare a thought for the Victorian pharmacist calmly handing a bottle across the counter, no different than handing over cough syrup, no idea that the very same extract would one day be treated as contraband. Spare a thought too for the people who bore the actual weight of prohibition, the ones swept up not because of anything they did that caused real harm, but because a word, a headline, a political ambition needed somewhere convenient to land, and their communities happened to be standing closest when it did. And spare a thought, finally, for how strange and how distinctly human this entire story is. A single plant, capable of being sacred and criminal, medicinal and demonized, corporate and countercultural, sometimes within the very same decade, depending entirely on who was holding the pen, who was writing the headline, and who happened to be standing trial. That is not really a story about a plant at all, when you get right down to it. It is a story about us, about how quickly fear can be manufactured when it is politically convenient, about how slowly evidence tends to travel compared to a good dramatic headline, and about how, eventually, given enough time and enough honest reckoning, the truth has a stubborn habit of finding its way back to the surface anyway, the way sunlight eventually finds its way through even the thickest cloud cover, because that is really the quiet thread running underneath everything we covered tonight. Whether it was ancient priests grinding leaves into paste for a sacred festival drink, or Nixon's own commission trying, and largely failing, to tell an administration something it did not want to hear, or a comedian in the 1970s gently, patiently proving through nothing more than good-natured slapstick that the whole moral panic had been built on considerably shakier ground than anyone in power wanted to admit at the time. The plant itself never really changed all that much across those thousands of years. What changed, over and over again, was us. Our fears, our politics, our willingness to believe a headline over a piece of actual research, and eventually our willingness to look back honestly at the damage some of those choices caused, and try, however imperfectly, however slowly, to make some kind of amends. So tonight, As you settle further into your pillow and let your thoughts grow soft and slow around the edges, maybe let this particular story be one that settles you rather than stirs you. Not every chapter of history needs to end with a tidy resolution to feel worth sitting with quietly before sleep. Sometimes it is enough to simply notice how long a story has been unfolding, how many different hands have shaped it, how many different fears and hopes and headlines it has passed through, on its way to wherever it currently sits. This one is still being written, still being argued over in state houses and courtrooms even now, but tonight at least, you get to set it down gently and let your own eyes grow heavy instead. Let the last thing you carry into sleep be something calm rather than something urgent. No axes, no pianos, no frantic headlines chasing each other across a front page. Just a plant, ancient and ordinary and endlessly complicated, finally allowed, after all these centuries of shouting and panic and slow, grinding reform, to simply exist a little more quietly in the world, and you, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, are allowed exactly the same thing. So let your breathing slow, let your shoulders soften into whatever you're resting on, and let the weight of the day, whatever it happened to carry, simply drift away from you now, the same way smoke drifts upward and disappears into the dark. Rest well, sleep easy, and we'll pick up the thread of some entirely different piece of history together again very soon.